All societies have those with power and those without. This was just as true for the Romans as it is for us. I can make this generalization because all societies have this fundamental divide. We can look at both Uruguay and Mongolia, and we will find the same distinction between those with political power, nobles, and those without, peasants. Any attempt to understand how politics work will fail if it does not take into account this fundamental distinction. So, in this essay, we will ask two questions. What makes someone a noble or a peasant? And what do all peasants and all nobles have in common? Of course, this question can be answered in many different ways, but I think that the key to this riddle is the question of who is interested in politics and why. Let me tell you a secret. You're weird. The average person would be scrolling through TikTok or watching something on the TV, but yet here you are, in your free time, reading an essay about some abstract political concept like aristocracy. So, why does the average person find such a conversation so fucking boring? And most importantly, why do we find such abstract topics so enticing? We certainly are not different species compared to the normal people who would rather be watching some sports ball or scrolling through their Instagram feed. And yet we are here. Why? This is a very personal question that I have been asking myself for a long time, because most of my friends and family seem disinterested in these questions that have always interested me. And so, this essay is my attempt to answer this very question. I believe that my interest in politics comes from my will to power. All people are interested in power, and I am certain that that is the reason why I am sitting in front of my Substack writing, instead of scrolling like my roomie over there. Simply put, thinking and writing about these concepts feels good. But why is my will to power engaged, given that I am not currently in any position of political power? Because I believe that if I have ideas that are good and interesting, other people will listen to me, and I might even have a small impact in the world of politics. So for me, reading and writing is my way to satisfy my will to power, and chances are that if you're reading this applies to you too. This is the fundamental drive behind all moralizing. We, who moralize, want to apply our morality onto others, presumably for their own good, and this justifies us using political power. As a consequence, when we moralize, we feel powerful, and we like it. The goal of moralizing is to create universal imperatives. The emphasis should be on universal, because we are doing what Kant did 200 years ago. We are making rules that apply to all humans without exception. We want to say that something is either good or bad, and because this judgment applies to everyone, it gives us the justification to seize political power so that we can enforce our moral imperatives in the name of all that is good and noble. Indeed, without universal moral imperatives, the state could not justify itself. In our current age, most governments justify their existence by saying that their mission is to protect the imperatives of liberty, democracy, and human rights. This is what Gaetano Mosca, a political scientist of the Italian elite school, calls a political formula. For example, the political formula of the Aztecs was that they had to make blood sacrifices to the gods, otherwise the sun would not rise tomorrow. The political formula of the Soviet Union was that they needed power to liberate the workers of the world and bring forth a classless, stateless utopia. Indeed, here, in this very case, we can witness what happens when a political formula fails: state collapse and revolution. Therefore, it is only logical that we feel powerful when we are reading and thinking, because in no uncertain terms, we are creating a brand new political formula inside of our heads. We are creating an argument that explains why we should actually be the ones with political power and not the current regime. And there we arrive at the fundamental distinction between us, who are obsessed with ideas, and those normal people who find it all very boring. we attempt to satisfy our will to power with ideas, while the rest of humanity does so with football games, shopping, and business ventures. The reason that I'm not calling this essay the Nietzschean distinction between nobles and peasants is that we all have a will to power. The difference is that nobles pursue power with universal ideas, while peasants do so with local symbols of power such as entertainment, social status, and most of all, money. If I may go on a tangent, the biggest mistake that most people make in the topic of class is that they associate status with money. There are no bigger peasants than those who believe that being high class is getting a new Ferrari or living in Tony Montana's mansion. Nobles are those who get their status from their character and not from their clothes or their mansion. However, this idea of money equals class comes from our good friends in marketing, who realize that this is the best way to convince people to buy outrageously priced products in the hope of appearing sophisticated. It is also important to mention that by no means are the labels of noble and peasant supposed to be statements of value, and indeed they could easily be replaced by intellectual and commoner or similar labels. There is no clear reason why it is better to be an intellectual than a normal person. Indeed, I do believe that peasants are far happier than most intellectuals. But now, this leads us to an interesting question. What happens when peasants achieve political power instead of nobles? Of course, there are more than enough non-ideological governments who are made up of peasants. One only needs to think of the average Latin American kleptocracy. All of these governments are based on the principle of patronage, which means that the government is run on political favors. These governments, however, are terribly unstable and inefficient. They cannot motivate their police to stop taking bribes. They cannot motivate their soldiers to risk their lives. And they cannot stop themselves from plundering their own nations like parasites. Such states are inherently unstable because a working state needs all of their bureaucrats and policemen to ignore their own personal interests by rejecting bribes and foregoing embezzlement. The state run by peasants cannot do this because there is only one force powerful enough to pull this off, and that is ideology. I think that we can make the statement that all stable governments have a political class that is interested in ideas as a means of getting power and justifying its own existence. Historically, we can also see that the regimes that have been run in the name of the peasants were actually run by nobles. The populares in the Roman Republic were not represented by the common people, but instead by Marius and Caesar, nobles who saw an opportunity to get some political power by representing the interests of the common people. Or the fact that almost all communists, with the exception of Stalin, were university educated and economically well off. Only a state run by nobles can have a coherent ideology that makes a functioning state possible. Government by ideological nobles might be the only way to paradise, but it is also the only way into hell. While a government run by peasants will be a dysfunctional mess, one needs to look at Colombia or even Honduras, but the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge could only be achieved with a government of fanatical nobles. So I am left with the conclusion that a country can only be stable and prosperous when nobles with good ideas are in power. This returns us to the ideas of the Italian elite school, but this time to Vilfredo Pareto. He states that the destiny of a nation depends on its aristocracy, because from the nobles will come the dominant ideology that will lead a nation to prosperity or to ruin. This is because fashion flows downward. Most ideas and lifestyles that are fashionable flow down from the aristocracy to the rest of society. This has been seen 1,000 times throughout history. For example, Christianity flowed down from the Roman nobility of the 4th century. Or, for a more recent example, take the acceptance of homosexuality. Gays found acceptance in the Oscar Wilde reading section of the European intelligentsia in the late 19th century, and only 70 years later came the first Pride parades. So if we want to understand our political situation as it currently stands, we need to ask one simple question. Who are the nobles that make up the political class, and what will this mean for the coming decades? Well, in Western democracies, we can see a political class of bureaucratic nobles. These ruling nobles are chronically obsessed with procedure, and because of this, we can see large and inflexible institutions that are in charge of the government. This certainly leads to inefficiency and short-sightedness because responsibility is not placed onto one capable person, but is divided among all the deputies and secretaries who pass it around like a game of hot potato. For example, all aging Western nations are going to have a pension crisis because there are simply too many retirees and too few workers. However, nobody wants to be responsible for this extremely unpopular but unavoidable issue of pension reform. So nobody takes responsibility, and the problem just keeps on getting worse. The second aspect of this ruling nobility is that it legitimizes itself in the name of equality, which means that they will go on to great lengths to try to achieve this equality among all sections of society and to try to help the disadvantaged. Finally, this aristocracy is also very cosmopolitan, very international. The nobles from Germany will be very similar to the nobles from Canada because they share to a large extent the same culture and the same values. So it would be incorrect to speak of local nobilities. Instead, we have an international nobility, a cosmopolitan nobility, which is sort of a historical first as well. And it is important to point out that the solution to all of these problems that come from the ideas that are popular with our current nobility is not to get rid of nobility, because nobility will always exist. There will always be some sort of aristocracy there. It can change in its ways, it can change in its ideas, but it is fundamental in human nature. That is something that I do believe. The only way to fix these problems is to have better ideas that are represented by better nobles, because what we have right now will simply not make do. But I am not too personally close to any noble bureaucrat to the point where I can confidently describe how they think and how their lives look like. So I will leave it here. Although I might dedicate a future essay to the daily lives and the mindset of our current nobility. In the next essay, I will catalog all the types of aristocracy that I think are possible and see what traits we can observe in each one of them. Thanks for watching, and thank you for your time.